won't make a formal speech now, but we will hear from the rest of the panelists. They'll give a 3-minute dialogue or speech or summary of their own to set it up. They'll also introduce themselves so that we can move this along a little faster. I'll cut them off at 3 minutes because we really want to get to the dialogue. So without much ado, we'll start our program off with the Reverend and get going.
My name is Lauren Smith. Can I be heard in the back? No, stand
up.
Okay. My name is Lauren Smith. I have been in Portsmouth now about 9 months. I moved here from Berkeley, California. I'm really glad to be here. My family has been in New England since about the middle of the 19th century. My family, my great-great-great-grandfather was a free black man in North Carolina and traveled. They were difficult times for free blacks before the Civil War for lots of reasons. And they traveled up through Oberlin, Ohio and across into New England. It was a big kind of pathway. They were in Oberlin for a number of years, and they participated in something called the Oberlin-Wellington Rescue, where men were recruited for the raid on Harper's Ferry. I have this wonderful letter from a man named John Copeland to my great-great-grandfather the night before he was hanged for his participation in that historical event. So my roots in New England and in New England African-American community are deep. One of the things I love about this particular movie is that it takes what's invisible and brings it into view. And I feel such a personal kind of spiritual affiliation to that task for various reasons. Part of that is personal. I'm an African-American woman, and I have fairly light skin and green eyes. And a lot of people assume that I have one black parent and one white parent, but in truth, all of the mixing in my family happened in the 19th century during a period of assumed access to the bodies of black women. And part of what goes with that, is access to education, money, situations where people made opportunities for their children that they wouldn't have necessarily made for other African-American children. Anyway, so I won't say too much about that, but I love this task of bringing the invisible into view. And the last thing I'll say about that is, so I come at this whole issue as a person with a particular perspective on all of this history, this rich history. And I also come to this as a minister, and looking at not so much, okay, looking back into history, what might I have done? But this spiritual situation of having a circumstance that is so shameful that we want to turn our eyes away from it. We want to turn our eyes away from suffering and pretend it doesn't exist and lay another storyline on top of it. That's a human situation that transcends every historical moment. And so part of the religious task is to attend to that pocket of shame and learn how to work with it, and learn how to work around it and over it and through it to create a world that's the kind of world that we want to live in and the kind of world we want to leave to our children, where there is justice, equity, and compassion among peoples. So that's why I'm here, I think. I think that's why I was asked. And I'm so glad to see so many people here.
I'm Barbara Ward, and I'm the director and curator at the Moffat-Ladd House in Portsmouth. And some of you know the Moffat-Ladd House as the home originally of John Moffat and Samuel Moffat. And you all know also that William Whipple lived in the house as well. I had only been here about 2 days as the director of the museum when I learned that Prince Whipple was probably the most famous person who ever lived in the house. And Prince Whipple was enslaved by William Whipple, as most of you know, and was one of the signers of the Petition of Freedom, along with Windsor Moffat, who was, and 18 others. Windsor Moffat was enslaved by John Moffat. What the story that we try to tell, and one of the things that I was just saying is probably one of the, it's hard for our interpreters, and it's also hard for our visitors, and it's hard for the school groups that we try to tell this story to, is that the Moffats, the Whipples, were all involved at some point in the slave trade. The involvement of New Hampshire in the slave trade is something that most people in New Hampshire are completely unaware of. It wasn't a dominant part of trade here, but it was definitely a part of it. And one thing that's interesting to me is we have only one document connecting John Moffat and one ship, the Snow Exeter, to the slave trade. That ship was sent to the West Indies, brought back to Portsmouth, re-outfitted, according to the logbook of the Snow Exeter, re-outfitted for the African trade and sent to the Guinea coast. And what I'll read to you is from the logbook. It reached, the ship left Portsmouth on June 15th, 1755. It arrived in Antigua 3.5 weeks later. It came back to Portsmouth on August 27th. It was re-outfitted for the African trade and left Portsmouth on November 13th, 1755. It reached the mouth of the Gambia River on January 2nd, 1756. For the next 6 days, the ship sailed along the coast and on January 8th made the high land of Cape Sierra Leone. That's some of what you saw in the film. The vessel may have traded for slaves at the factory there, but more likely followed the coast, as many American vessels did. When the ship reached Anamabu, which was a major slave trading port along the coast of West Africa, something happened. We don't know exactly what, but the captain of the ship died, and the ship stayed there for quite some time. And all we know later is that there is accounting of what was on the ship because of Captain Russell's death. And it included 61 enslaved men, women, and children who were later sold in the West Indies. Now, this is a direct document, but there's other evidence as well. And a lot of this evidence has been put together in an honors thesis that was done at Dartmouth College in 2009 by a young man named Eric Luritzen, who is now living in California, so far as I know, but it remains very, very interested in the topic. Most of this information was taken from the slave trade database, and he was very interested in trying to identify not only direct trading ventures that could really, where the owners could be identified as coming from New Hampshire, but also to focus in on some of what James was talking about in these indirect connections with the trade. Interestingly to us too, is in the slave trade database, there is mention of the ship the Black Prince. The Black Prince was owned by William Whipple, Joseph Whipple, and George Meserve. And that ship brought in 1764 loaded 145 slaves at the coast of West Africa and sold some in Barbados, and we don't know where the rest were sold. The Moffats also had connections to Robert Trail, and Robert Trail, through he was Whipple's brother-in-law, they were also trading, and he was one of the ones who was in charge of the sale of Africans from right on the docks here in Portsmouth. And we get a sense of a nexus. This is something that they were trying, that they just felt it was part of the possibilities for trade. And this is something we have to confront. We have to understand that it happened here in Portsmouth. And one of the hardest things for us, or hardest things for me, I think sometimes, is when I try to talk about it and I tell groups about it, they don't say anything. The kids don't say anything, their teachers don't say anything, nobody's prepared to receive this information. And I think we have to change that, and we hope to be a part of it at the Moffat Ladd House.
Good morning. Thanks everybody for coming out. It's a lovely, lovely spring day, and you're here to partake of this feast, so I appreciate that. I'm Jeff Bolster. I teach history at the University of New Hampshire. My first book years ago was in African American history during the era of the slave trade. I've been sort of intimately involved with this. I worked in the Caribbean for many years. I've been to many of these sites, been to Cuba, been to West Africa, been in the slave ports, and so I sort of feel this personally. That said, unlike Lauren's family, I'm just a Johnny-come-lately to New England. My people are all like post-potato famine Irish, early 20th century Scandinavian immigrants, and the rest. And yet the irony is, until very recently, put Lauren and me in a room and asked, like, who was the old New Englander? It was the white guy with the beard, and the colored girl. I mean, so this disconnect has been colossal. Black Americans have these deep roots in the United States. And yet, as James was talking about, oh, this isn't me. White people trying to push this back. This isn't me. Ellis Island, immigrants showing up there right after the Civil War. That's a huge bulge of American immigration. I suspect that most of the, quote, white people in the room here are descendants of people who came then, whether you're Polish or Italian or Scandinavian or whatever. And the line is that the first word these people would learn getting off the boat was okay. That's American, but it's actually an African word. And then the second word these European immigrants would learn getting off the boat was near. Because that suddenly gave them the leg up that James was talking about, where these recent immigrants could leapfrog over people who had been American for generations, people of color. So, as a historian, I can talk about many aspects of this film. I think it's a great film because it makes us ask questions. I would say this is a film about history, it's a film about evil, it's a film about spirituality, about forgiveness, and it's really about questions, many of which probably cannot be answered. But sometimes the journey is as valuable as getting to the end. Let me say two simple things here. Number one, as Americans, this is a story that is deeply about race. And it's really hard for us as Americans to imagine the story in other than racial terms. It's like a black-white thing. And we talk about complicity, and we talk about guilt, and we talk about victimization, and it's there. It's a black-white thing. Yet as human beings, this ain't a black-white thing. Slavery, it's like marriage, old institution. It's like eating meat, carnivorousness, old institution. Slavery had been around for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And the word slave, where's it from? Slavs, Roman Empire, they had slaves. They were white people. Scandinavian Vikings had slaves. They were white people. Japanese people had slaves. They were other Asian people. Tupanima Indians in Brazil had slaves. Yeah, they were other Indians from the Latin American jungle. So this slavery thing, it's been around for a long time. People have been doing this to each other in a long, distinct way. Now, our particular story is, as Americans, we can't get beyond the black-white thing. And I'm not saying we should sweep it under the rug. Much of my career has been devoted to not sweeping it under the rug. But on the other hand, I got to say, in the future, people are going to look back at us and they're going to say, oh, they were the people that ate meat. Because maybe eating meat won't be so fashionable in the future. Or they were the car people. They used up all the oil. Or they were the plastic water bottle people, you see. So every generation is complicit in certain ways and different things. So I'm trying to say here that as Americans, we look at this story, it is deeply racial, and we need to sort that out. But as human beings, this is part of a much longer history in which people have been doing bad things to each other and to the world around them that is not racialized at all. And in fact, on the beach in West Africa, when the Danish seamen came ashore, or the Spanish seamen, or the English, or whoever, it was very much a class thing. We have very elite Africans selling other Africans to elite Europeans, some of whom were beating to death the European sailors that were on their ships. So that wasn't really a racial thing. See? So this is a very complicated story. And that's why I don't think we're probably going to get to answers today, but raising questions and trying to speak about this would be useful. Thank you.
So thank our panelists for the first introductory to this dialogue that we're about to have. There are words that are brought up that we know are emotionally packed words. Racism, white privilege, shame, anger, mistrust, and all of those deeply emotional held beliefs that we carry on from generation to generation. So into the floor to open the dialogue. My partner and I, Cord Whitaker, he'll take that half of the room and I'll take this half of the room. And we plan to facilitate the dialogue between you and our panelists. So, the floor is open.
Question right here.
I was born and raised in a little town called Weldon, North Carolina, which is right across the border from Virginia. That was 81 years ago that I came to Earth. It's a Ku Klux Klan stronghold, Weldon was, and a lot of dogs live better than us black folks did. But in the South, there are two sides to the slavery stick. A fellow like me, the white population immediately know that I have white in my family. But if a person is Africanoid, black, with bushy hair and whatnot, he cannot work at the jobs that I work. Me, I could work inside the family houses as a butler and as a caretaker. He had to work in the yards and in the woods. And I call it one big unhappy family down south. Because if a slave owner goes down to the slave cabin and has sex with one of the slave women.
I'm sorry, but is there a question that you want to ask the panel?
Yes. The question is, I've been around, I've been to thousands of these things. I've never heard anybody call the gathering of the South how we are one big unhappy family down there between the blacks and the whites. We all have brothers, all have sisters, have cousins. So, could you bring that up? And I'll sit down.
Thank you so much.
You know, I mean, I think I alluded to the same thing. John Mercer Langston was one of our first, do you know what?
Stand up.
I'm sorry. I think I alluded to the same thing. And what's interesting to me is to bring that into the present tense. And I've heard a lot of people look at contemporary black folks in positions of power and extrapolate that because they are fairer skinned and they're more mixed with white, that somehow they you know, that accounts for what they've been able to accomplish. When in reality, the economic connections, what I think it was you said about the ways that families progress over time, that in reality they move up socioeconomically slowly. The roots of that, of folks in power, the way they look, is rooted years and years and years ago. So the roots of some of my success as a family has to do with the fact that my great-great-great-grandfather was freed in the 19th century and had access to money, had access to a road that went north. John Copeland, the man from whom my great-great-grandfather received that letter, also looked a lot like me. And that was a lot of the reason that it was difficult for free blacks in the north, or in the south, is that there was this, there was the fear that they were somehow involved in the Underground Railroad, liberation, and they were. So I think it's a really important thing, and to make it visible, the liberation movements of black people, and also to sort of undercut that assumption that just sort of lingers back there in a lot of people's heads, which really doesn't have any relationship to sort of genetic reality.
I just wanted to touch on this a little bit because we were talking about southern slavery and the north. And my experience is that when I'm in the south, it's more open. The history of slavery is much more open, much more visible, much more talked about. When we come north, it disappears. It never existed. So, to me, that dialogue, we know that there's infighting, and we know the reason why it is between African Americans. So, it's visible. It's made known when that happens in the South. But it happens in the North as well. We just make it invisible or pretend it's something else. We'll take, sorry.
Yes, I have a question directed to the earlier educator, I guess we should call it. My My family were Quakers, early settlers in Rhode Island. They settled Newport, as a matter of fact. And I was raised to believe that Quakers were not slaveholders. You find Rhode Island as a Quaker state and the center of trades, of the slavery trade. How do you explain this paradox?
I was telling someone earlier that one of the events that I most enjoyed going to, I'll stand up then so you can hear better. One of the events that I most enjoyed going to was a Quaker meeting outside of Philadelphia. Because these were people who very sincerely wanted to talk about these issues as a society and as a nation, but they too had heard the same thing about the Quaker story. And so for them, what was really difficult was at the outset hearing me talk about the fact that for a long time, the people who were importing slaves into Pennsylvania were Quakers. That Quakers were very, very active in the slave trade and slave owning. That it took many generations before Quakers became largely abolitionist. And so in any place like Rhode Island, you're going to have Quakers who were active in slave owning, active in the slave trade, or happily connected to it for a very long time. Now it's true that Quakers came early to the abolitionist party, right? So it wouldn't surprise me in the least that those few abolitionists that we know were in Rhode Island, for example, in 1780 or 1800 or 1820, included Quakers. But by no means all Quakers for a very long time. It wasn't until much later that it became a solid part of the Quaker mindset that we were abolitionists and that this was our fight.
Thank you.
In the back there, Frank? All the way in the back?
All the way to the back? Thank you. We all know, well, I can't say we all, most of us know some history as far as the blacks and whites of America. But before 2008, and prior to the awakening, what I consider the awakening of 2009, November 2nd of 2009, race really wasn't that much of an issue. I got along with my white partners, and we go places, and we never thought about many things as far as being black and white. Not when we were together. Maybe separately we would have thought differently and said things that we don't normally speak in front of another race. My question to each of you on the panel is, how do we move forward? Not just discussing the history of the differences of slavery in America and in between blacks and whites in the North and South. How do we move forward? How do we get beyond the history and start making a future for America?
Most historians duck that question by saying, oh no, we specialize looking backwards. I think that the backstory I can give is that it's really, really important that we recognize how far we've come, and that in 1940 there were virtually no black policemen in the United States. In 1940 there were no black sports stars in the United States. There certainly weren't black university presidents at Ivy League places, or on and on, the creation of the black middle class. So things have gotten much better. That said, they are by no means fixed. And so I always like to try to plant the seed that things have gotten much better. It's not just same old, but it needs to get better yet. And in terms of where we go from here, boy, that is a really, really tough one. I think that some concrete things, such as some form of reparations to those who have been so far left behind, has some practical value, but I don't think it has any political traction at all, so couldn't speak to that. The one other piece I would add to that is there's a new book out. It's called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colored Blindness. It's a very powerful book, and it really is speaking to the fact that while we have a black president, while we made all this progress in many ways, that there are so many brothers locked up in the Supermax, and that it's changed the demography of black families, and these guys get out, and it's really hard to get a job, and so, we got this whole Jim Crow thing in this era right now, which is locking people up, and that's something that's got to stop.
remember who it was, when he asked, they were in Ghana, and they asked the minister to perform a ritual for them, and he kind of said, well, you know, you have to do your own ritual, you know? So to me, that speaks a little bit of, you know, a starting place for a movement. How do you feel about that?
You know, in my experience, the question of whether it needs to be your own elders, right? This is the man's phrase. It was you need to turn to your own elders for this, meaning white people need to deal with other white people. I think that's a very difficult question, and I think it depends person to person what they want. White people, black people, people of other races vary in whether they want to talk mostly about this within their own racial group or across racial lines. And one of the things I learned making this film, taking this journey, was to respect that different people have different experiences of race and different comfort levels, different instincts with who to talk to make personal progress. And that, in fact, is why in the film, and you saw the abridged version, so you didn't quite see this moment in its full glory, but as we're sitting in that hotel room talking, I complain that I think this project has become self-indulgent. And you see Holly, one of the other 10 of us, quite disturbed and wanting to know what I meant by that. And the reason is because what we're talking about is her desire, and the desire of several other people in that room, that white people only talk with other white people about this. That they stop trying to talk with black people and only talk to other white people. From my background, my experience, to do that, to stop talking with friends who are black, only talk to those who are white, would have been the wrong way to approach this. But for her and for a lot of other people, it makes a lot of sense, and I think you have to have that diversity. And if maybe I could just address your question, when I go around the country and talk to people about this film and about race, you know, I find a lot of people who, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank here, but you know, there are a lot of people who approach this question not wanting to talk about race at all. And if they're forced to, they want to do it as little as possible and then get out. And they don't know why. In many cases, they don't know why they don't want to talk about race. And I think it has a lot to do with the history that we don't talk about. That they don't even know what it is, but they know there are issues they don't want to get into. For other people, they know enough about the history that they know they don't want to talk about it, or they're willing to talk about it, but because the history has so many angles, so many awkward and uncomfortable truths, there's a limit to how far they want to go. And in my experience, therefore, it's tremendously important to start with the history, and to not only learn about it, but to discuss it, so people are comfortable acknowledging very difficult truths. And we've only scratched the surface so far this morning of what some of those difficult truths are. There are a lot of other Americans, in my experience, who, when they talk about race, where they run up against a wall, where they can't make progress, is because of myths that come out of this history. It's the white Americans, for example, who say the problem with race today is that black people keep wanting to talk about it. They want to talk about it again and again. It's a mindset of victimhood. I hear this all the time. It's people being divisive by talking about the past. Until they learn enough about our history to know that that's not the problem, they can't move forward in the conversation. It's white Americans who say, completely well-intentioned, we've gone too far with programs like affirmative action. It's harder to be a white person in this country now than a black person. I hear this a lot. And what I finally learned is, those kind of comments are not about hate. They're about ignorance. It's about not knowing this history, and it's about not knowing how this history connects to today. It's about this history blinding us to how much prejudice is a part of our society today, and how much, even if we could be colorblind with the snap of a finger, how much still would remain to be done that we would be blind to because we were being colorblind. And so I think there's just a tremendous amount of education and discussion that must happen before most people can move forward.
And I'd like to say that this experience that I've had with talking about this in front of, you know, a school group will come to the house and we'll talk about it, and you know, I'll talk about the slave trade and explain the role of the Moffats in this, and I'll be looking at a group of kids, and most of them are white, and maybe one or two are black. And those black kids look at me, and I think, they don't want to say anything. But I wonder, the teacher, I don't think, is saying anything. And they've got this dilemma. They want the kids to all feel the same. They want them to feel equal. They want them to feel, they want to brush away the issue of race. And yet, these kids who are sitting there know that this is very much an important historical thing for them. And I look at these kids and I wonder, they must feel so disconnected from the fact that their teachers won't talk about it. How do they bring this up? But the white kids should feel the same way. And this is what bothers me, the teachers who just don't want to talk about it. And we get this with visitors. You'll get a visitor who asks a question, did they have enslaved people in this household? And you say, yes. And you explain it to them, and that's all they want to know. It doesn't go any further. You don't get into any discussions. You don't. And I think that's the thing that bothers me, is that there's not a willingness to talk about this history. The Moffett Ladd House is owned by the National Society of the Colonial Dames in New Hampshire. That means that everybody has a colonial ancestor. And after I first talked about this in front of a meeting of the Colonial Dames, one of the women came up to me and said, I am so glad that we are talking about this. She said, she has ancestors from the South and from the North, and she said, I'm sick and tired of everybody up here in the North acting like it's just a Southern thing. I am so glad to hear you talking about it. So I think that's what we really need to do. I think we need to talk about it more, and we need to bring it into our educational programs. And so,
One quick question, one quick response before we go to.
Jeff, what do you find in your UNH classes as far as the reactions of your students?
They're largely clueless. Most of them aren't malicious. I mean, I had an African-American man from Roxbury in a class, probably 10 years ago. He's a really smart guy. He's done well out of school, but very dark-skinned African-American guy. And he told me that when he got to UNH, somebody in his dorm came up to him and took his hand and said, what's the matter with your hand? How come it's lighter on one side and darker on the other? You know? So the point is there's just this colossal disconnect, you know? I'll just say one quick thing, and the question is race a good thing or is race a bad thing? And I'll frame that by saying up until the 1950s, in the United States, everybody knew what the system was. White supremacy. Some people thought it was good, some people thought it was bad, but everybody knew what the system was. Then there's about a 20-year period with Martin Luther King and some Jewish intellectuals and Rosa Parks and some other people trying to do the colorblind thing. We're going to make this liberal, colorblind society and make race go away. And that didn't really last long or work out. And now we're in multiculturalism where actually difference is celebrated. Except a lot of stuff ain't talked about. So that's, our students now, the college kids and high school kids these days, they have come up in this age of multiculturalism. They didn't live through Jim Crow, and they don't know anything about that sort of liberal, colorblind dream, except they heard a little bit about it. So they come up with this multiculturalism thing, which in some ways they're very politically correct, and they want to celebrate diversity. But in other ways, they're clueless, and they don't have the backstory about how white privilege is so ingrained and enduring in the society, how it's palpable. And that makes it very hard for them to talk about because they don't really want to feel like they're contributing to the problem because they actually got a poster of, Michael Jordan or some rapper in their dorm room.
Jeff, you bring up the whole notion of white privilege, that that legacy of white privilege. And there was, I don't think it was in this abridged version, but there was this awesome moment in the film where the family was sitting down and they were talking, well, we don't see where we have this privilege. And, it was brought up. I think Catherine said, well, where did you go to school? And where did you go to school? And everybody had gone to Harvard, and their grandfather had gone to Harvard, and their grandfather before that had gone to Harvard. So it was like the notion of white privilege is so far removed from the majority's mindset that you can't see, and if you can't see your privilege, then you can't see how another person was not privileged.
If I could, I didn't realize you were seeing the version that didn't have it. There's a slightly longer version that has that scene. And the interesting thing is, the focal point of that scene, you described it well, but the focal point of that scene isn't that a lot of people who agreed to go on this journey were Ivy League educated, which is interesting enough, believe me. The scene starts off with my father, who did go to Harvard, complaining that he came from a middle-class family and was very uncomfortable that the producers of the film were constantly putting us in scenes that made us look wealthy. They were putting us in fine dining rooms to eat meals and discuss, and he said, I hope this isn't going to look like we all live this sort of a life. In other words, he was describing growing up the son of a minister who never owned his own home, didn't have all that much money, and there were a couple of very wealthy members in that group of 10 and didn't want to be confused with them. So he's complaining about the ways in which he doesn't have privilege. And he complains and says, and you insisted on talking about the fact that I went to Harvard, and he gets sucked into with a couple of questions, explaining that going to Harvard wasn't about his having privilege. He says it was a privilege going to Harvard, but I would have gone to Harvard if I'd grown up in a very different family than the DeWolf family. He says there were middle-class kids, there were kids from all walks of life in my Harvard class. And of course what he completely misses is what the odds are that you're going to be able to go to Harvard if you grow up in an old established New England family, right? Or in a family of recent immigrants or a working class family. The reason he didn't notice that privilege, and of course it's very easy not to notice, how easy it is to get what you get, especially if it's something as intangible as skin color, but the reason he didn't notice was because he was thinking about the ways in which he didn't have privilege. And I think we all do that. We look up and are defensive about people who have more privilege, and we don't notice the ways in which there are other people who don't have our privilege.
Valerie?
Oh, I'll wait till I been here for 15 years, and when I moved here, I thought I was living in a really white town. You didn't see black people. If you did, you saw them at the supermarket. And it seems like every time there's a sensational something going on, if it's a black person, it's a big thing in the newspapers. If it's a white person, it's kind of, moved over. And I thought, I lived in Boston, and it wasn't like that. It's worse here. Why?
Can I just draw a bit more out of your question? Exactly what do you mean by a big sensational thing? Do you mean something that's cast in a negative light in the news media? Is that what you're saying? Okay.
I don't agree with that. I'm sorry, but I don't, because I know that there are a lot of people who have had issues. I'm going to use Bert Cohen as an example, who was tortured by the press in our community. Whether you agree with him or not, he was not, and so we have a newspaper in town who I think treats everybody. So I take offense to that, not offense, but I disagree with your comment because I think that, I don't think that I'm talking about the Portsmouth Herald, which is the only paper that really, or the Foster, Daily Democrat, but it's mostly the Portsmouth Herald that does this. And so everybody's, who does anything wrong in this community, whether you're black, white, Asian, you're going to get tortured by that. So I don't really understand, and I don't agree, if you're just talking about this community of this town, or the seacoast.
Go ahead.
It strikes me, though, that you are talking about an issue of normativity. I mean, it is the case nationally that in most news media, when a person when the major characters having any kind of ethnic identity, it's because they're not white, right? And if they, and I might actually challenge you on, you're saying it's not that way in Boston.
Right. That was the part I
I think it's that way in Boston.
Recent news, yeah.
And I'm from Philadelphia, and it's definitely that way in Philadelphia as well. And Philadelphia is much more multi-ethnic than Boston. And it's simply a national, instill extant that whiteness is not heteronormative, whiteness is normative. Whiteness is the norm. And all things that deviate from that need to be mentioned, need to be discussed. So I use need in quotes, but get mentioned, get discussed. And I think that may be some of what you're perceiving.
And I would also just add a little bit to that. If we were to close our eyes for a minute and, listen to something on the news and they said a robbery was committed and the guy had a hood on, I mean, the person that would come right into your mind, I don't even have to say what that picture would be. But that's our media. Go ahead.
I just wanted to, we were all responding to the question of, I'm sorry, we all responded to the question of where do we go from here, and I still had an answer to that. So I want to say it. There's a contemporary Jewish folk singer named Dan Byrne who wrote this amazing song called God Said No. He walks to the edge of town, he meets God. And he's talking to God and said, send me back, I want to go save Kurt Cobain. And he says, no, if you did that, you would just ask him where you could get a lawyer, where you could get a contract. And then he says, well, I want to go back and I want to go back and take down Hitler. And he says, no, if you did that, you would end up taking a lover and get caught up in theories and distractions. And he says, well, I want to go back and save Jesus, take him down from the cross. And he says, no, if you could do that, you would stare, eyes no longer seeing, ears no longer hearing. And he says, God said, time belongs to me, time's my secret weapon. And I knew that and the man says, I knew that I was beaten and now was all I had. And he walks away from the edge of town. So this situation of an economic structure that has a foundation of injustice is contemporary.
Yes.
And now is all we have.
Yep.
So I think that our task is really to look at what is the economic structure on which our well-being is grounded, and where is there justice, and where is there injustice? How do we work to dismantle injustice where it exists and build up systems of justice where it doesn't? And it could be as simple as just walking into your closet and looking at all the tags of the clothes and saying, well, where are these countries and what's going on in these countries? And I think that's where do we go from here, where is hope? Because I really do think, at the end of his life, Martin Luther King was talking about the triple threat of militarism, poverty, and racism. And he had come from looking at race to seeing the deeper roots in this triumvirate of economic injustice, militarism, and racism. And I think that's where the answer is today.
Thank you, Lynn. That was very nicely put. One other response that I've just had here, thinking about this, where we go, is that sometimes we ignore our racial identities. Sometimes we actually reflexively go to them, and we do this in different ways. And a story I can tell that to me has emblematized hope for a while is back in the Rodney King riots in LA. This is now probably 15, 16 years ago. 20, excuse me. Time goes by. I don't do modern American history, The story that hit me the hardest in that was the following. There was an African-American truck driver who lived in the neighborhood, and he was at home watching TV, watching these riots unfold like 2 blocks from his house, and what he saw was an 18-wheeler that had this white truck driver in it get stopped at an intersection, and a bunch of young African-American males came out and just started beating up the guy because he was white. and the black truck driver who lived several blocks away, named Reginald Denny, he's watching the TV, and he just connects that this is not right. And so, as a young African-American man, he goes out into the street, into the heart of the riot, and he gets to the place where these guys are beating up this guy, and he sort of diffuses it somehow, and then because he knew how to drive an 18-wheeler, he got the injured white truck driver into the truck and drove him to the emergency room in the hospital. And the doctors later said that that saved the guy's life. When Denny was interviewed about this, he said, I'm home watching TV, and I see there's a riot in my neighborhood, and I see this guy who's like me. He's a truck driver. In other words, this guy privileged his occupational identity as a truck driver over his racial identity as a black. He didn't say, those brothers are wailing on him, I'm going to go out and kick his white behind. No, he said, I'm going to help this guy. And so there's a moment, it's this little emblematic moment in our nation's history where you get to choose sometimes whether you want to be white or you want to be black or maybe you want to be something else. And it's not like we're ever going to forget or lose our racial identities, but there's other cards to play. And that man's action at that moment sort of struck me.
We had a question right here up front.
Valerie.
Oh, I'm sorry, Valerie. Okay, sorry, Valerie. And then we'll move down here to Michelle.
Actually, I probably should wait until the end to say this, but I think James mentioned both in the film and his comments afterwards, a couple things that I feel like compelled to say this. This is an example of an uncomfortable truth, perhaps. How many of you know that Portsmouth, New Hampshire, has a sister city in Ghana? Okay, that's number one. Number two is, although I find no fault in the film, and I'm not saying this because I'm criticizing the film, I'm only using that as an example of other observations that I have made of documentaries, films, pictures in magazines, you name it, that always focus on the poverty and the sadness and the downtrodden of Africa. And Ghana I'm going to speak of in particular because that's where I have my own personal experience, along with some others in the room here, where of course those things exist, and I'm not in any way trying to diminish that, but there is more to Africa, and there certainly is much more than that to Ghana. There are cities where people look just like us, dressed the same way we are, who go off to work every morning and come home every night fighting the traffic and the smog in the city. And I want to see more of that so that we can talk about normalization in those places too, so that I have relatives who don't want to go to Africa because they don't want to see the stuff that they see on TV all the time, and trying to convince them that, oh, well, yeah, it's there, but there's more to it than that. There's more to the story than that.
In fact, Valerie, if I can piggyback off your question, and then the panel will respond as well. But this actually goes back to what I've been thinking since the gentleman in the back first asked this question about what we can do to move forward. It does have everything to do with narratives. Narrative is an incredibly I mean, that's what this film is about. It's about narratives. That's what all the panelists have said so far is about narratives. And American culture has a particular predilection, which may look like a norm to us, because most of us in this room are probably American, brought up here for the most part. But we have a particular predilection for feel-good stories that is very American. Our founding myths, our foundational myths about the Declaration and breaking from England and all of that is all highly positive, the way we treat it generally. If you actually read the foundational documents, they're full of anxiety and fear and worry. They are full of a fear of being apart from Britain at the same time as a desire to be apart from Britain, right? It was not a happy time. But we just because of our own cultural predilections, the stories we tell children, for instance, are all happy. And they've become increasingly happy. If you look back at Grimm's fairy tales, which kind of don't tell as much anymore, they're not happy. This same thing, for an example, movies that do well in America tend to have happy endings. Movies that do well in France do not. So these are very, very cultural things. And this makes it difficult for us to deal in this country in general, but also certainly in particular places, especially in the north, to deal with the darker side of these stories that we've told ourselves. This is why the teachers, when they come to the Moffat-Ladd House, there's silence in response to the stories you're telling them, because we've been taught from a very young age to not like sad stories. But we have control over how narratives work, and we can construct different narratives. We can develop different ways of reading narratives and thinking about narratives. But that itself is a long process in which people have to become more and more engaged. Projects like this film are a part of doing that. So I think, to your thing about normalizing thought about Africa and thought about other continents as well. That's important. It's about the narratives we tell about them. And for a very long time now, we've been telling narratives that that don't show you that being in Accra is kind of like being in New York.
Before you answer, just to put this, and then we'll, there's the moment in the film where, as a black woman looking at it, I would say it was the uncomfortable moment for the white people being in there, when the African-American woman said, for once, I'd like to be at a place where white people are not, that they're not interfering in my moment. And as a person of color, right away you get to that, and right away the white people want to distance them from that, because they say, oh, we're open now, come, accept us, And so that moment is talking about bringing the uncomfortable to some place where you can actually talk and move with it. So.
Valerie, thank you for raising a very, very appropriate criticism of the film. As you point out, we're not the first film to depict Africa that way, but we absolutely do that ourselves. We continue that way that Americans all too often look at Africa. I don't want to criticize Katrina for that choice simply because I now know that it's very hard to shoehorn everything you want to into a film like this. If you depict Africa in a different light, you have to explain that to the viewer. By shorthanding Africa in a terribly stereotypical and dehumanizing way, she does get to move quickly onto other subjects. But it's deeply unfortunate. And in that light, and in the spirit also of telling these uncomfortable truths, it's interesting that on the DVD extras, we have a series of interviews with scholars, most of whom actually appear in shortened form in the film, where you get to see a little more time with us talking with these scholars. And with a scholar in Africa who appears very briefly in the full version of the film, what you don't see in the film but you see in his extra on the DVD is he talks quite a bit about Africa's complicity in the trade. Jeff, I think you were the one who mentioned that it's Europeans and Americans trading with Africans.
This is Kofi Andidoho?
It's not actually Kofi Andidoho, it's Robert Adofening, who's, Kofi Andidoho is a revered poet in Ghana, but this person I'm talking about is a historian at the University of Ghana. He talks about the fact that the slave trade was before colonialism in Africa. So he says, we were freely trading with Europeans and Americans. And he had to confront two things that his own graduate students were objecting to. First, they said, that can't be true. Europeans must have come here with guns and made us trade. He said, no. That was colonialism afterwards. At this time, the Europeans had no power. We did this freely. And then they said, well, it must have been the elite people. And we had to get into an explanation that actually, just like here in New England, it wasn't a few elite people, everyone was involved in benefiting, right? Those who were enslaved were coming from other societies. Just like here, it was the other who was being enslaved and sold. Right? And you mentioned that wonderfully uncomfortable moment in the film where this African-American woman is saying she wants nothing to do with us. The interesting thing is that's another example of a shorthand in the film, and it's something that's understandable, we can recognize, highlights our discomfort. The backstory to that is also fascinating, and about, again, humanizing the African experience. The people who were most uncomfortable, we gathered for something called Panifest. It was a Pan-African celebration. We came over, we flew over on a plane full of African Americans who were coming to reconnect with their African roots, and she was one of them. The people who were most uncomfortable during our stay in Africa were actually the African Americans who'd come for that festival. Because what they discovered, as wonderful as I think that experience was for most of them, what they discovered was the Ghanaians were much more interested in us, in the white Americans. Now, part of that was about race and their perception of who counts. But the other part of that was, when they engaged with African Americans, they said very openly, we welcome you here. Your ancestors came from this continent, not from Ghana. We were selling your ancestors. And they were very clear about that. Our ancestors sold your ancestors to this family, right? And then they explained that these African Americans were in fact Americans first and foremost. So for them it wasn't all about race. And they wanted to talk about Ghana getting the help it needs now after colonialism. And in fact it was to such an extent that the local word in Ghana that was used to apply to us literally means white. And the word they used to describe the African Americans they were talking with was the same word, it was white. Because what mattered wasn't the race, it was that they were foreigners, and foreigners from a wealthy country. Right? These are the kind of uncomfortable truths, but also the ways in which we can humanize a society that, yes, in the film is given this very stereotypical look.
I'll just say one more thing. If we're going to see these images of Africa that show poverty and all of that, then we also have to understand why this exists. Imagine if all of the able-bodied young people, teenagers, let's say 12 through 40, male and female, were just taken away by aliens from outer space, from this country. What do you suppose this place would look like? Not just today, but 10 years from now and a generation from now.
1 second. We'll have, no, this, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but your hand went up first, and then we'll go back. Go ahead. You. Yes. Yeah.
When I was in, say, the 6th grade, and we started to cover the subject of the Civil War, and the people in the North were described as against slavery, and the people in the South were for slavery. Now that sounded nice and simple, and it wasn't until much later that we were really talking about economics and power. And has any attempt been made to change what we teach our children at that kind of level?
There are lots of attempts. The trouble is, Texas controls school books. If the authorities in Texas don't want to change that story, and they don't, it has to be done through individual programs or supplementary materials. Our organization, the Tracing Center, spends a lot of time going to schools and historic sites and talking about what the Civil War really was about, changing that narrative. But it has to be done, one group of school children at a time.
In fact, there is talk of really even getting the word slavery out of textbooks now. There's the big push that it's not even mentioned in. So our further generations as we go on won't even know that it exists. More forgetting.
And just to piggyback on that, I think that one of the really important aspects of the film is its attention to the historical amnesia in New England. I grew up in Connecticut, and for a long time, just like the man in the back said, we all learned the story that the boys in blue marched off to free the slaves, and it's just flat wrong. So the sense of the film conveying that complicity, where every farmer, every mill worker, every shipwright, every insurance agent in 19th century New England is wrapped up in this economy that is driven by Southern cotton. And the wealth that's created from that is invested in ways that lots of us benefited from. And that story is simply not told, and it needs to be, but it's not going to be as long as the
Well,
Texas
you know,
Patrol
it's like with,
School.
it's like with the lads who owned the house later, the Alexander Hamilton lad who lived in the house, the family had a lot of economic problems after the end of shipping, really, after the War of 1812, and were less important in shipping, so they hunted around for something they could do, and they landed on cotton, and acting as cotton brokers with Southerners for the New England cotton mills. And Alexander Hamilton Ladd lived in Galveston, Texas, half of the year, and half of the year he was in Portsmouth. He had a son who was in the Union Army, and he had two sons-in-law one was in the Union Navy, one was in the Union Army. Yeah, he didn't want the country broken up. Yeah, he was a unionist. He wanted that trade to continue to go on. Can we assume that he was fighting against slavery? No, he was profiting from the whole system. I think he believed that Texas probably would never secede. He turned out to be wrong. But what did he do after the war? He went right back down to Texas and continued that trade. I don't think, when you can look at families like that, you say, they didn't necessarily see this as an end to slavery.
We've had a question down front here for some.
Okay.
Yeah, we're not too assertive on this side.
Lynn, you're...
I think conversation is very important, but I think experience is even more important. And I just want to share that our daughter went to Exeter High School, and when she started looking at colleges, she wanted to go to Colby, she wanted to go to Amherst, and we took her around to all those colleges. She goes, they all look alike. And we went to Amherst, they all look alike. And we went to the University of Massachusetts, she goes, walked into the student union, she says, this is where I want to go. It was like the world was walking around that student union. She ended up going to the University of Rhode Island. And because she wanted a diverse experience, she had many friends of many colors, and they went to the Mall of Rhode Island, whatever it is, down in Providence, and she was with 3 or 4 of her black friends, and they were walking around, and she realized how uncomfortable it was, because all the sales clerks were watching them. And they were watching them because she was with her black friends. And she said, I realize what it's like. It's terrible to be constantly looked at like this. And I think we could do anything for our children, is to give them a diverse experience so that it's not whites talking to blacks, it's whites and blacks living the experience.
2 comments. One is